Welcome. Today we're turning to the topic of racism, bigotry, and xenophobia as founding ideological values, ideological thoughts, which are associated with right-wing populism in many countries, in the United States, but also in many countries in Europe. Many countries have witnessed the rise of populist movements which have made use of racist ideas, bigoted ideas, nationalist and xenophobic ideas as potent tools for right-wing populist mobilization. And today we're focusing on the question of how racism has become such a powerful component of right-wing populism. What motivates men, and sometimes women, to fervently support violent, far-right, racist organizations? There's a comment which I feel like we need to highlight in this course, politics and democracy and the politics of division and hate. This comes from Senator Mike Lee of Utah, who tweeted during the vice presidential debate last week, "We are not a democracy. The word democracy appears nowhere in the Constitution, perhaps because our form of government is not a democracy. It's a constitutional republic. Democracy isn't the objective. Liberty, peace, and prosperity are. We want the human condition to flourish. Rank democracy can thwart that." And I think the question we all have to pose for ourselves, how can one possibly understand such a statement coming from a US senator? So I've asked you to read some additional materials from Cass Moody's most recent book called The Far Right Today. This book is really a very penetrating study of the far right around the world, in the United States, but also in Europe, India, Hungary, Turkey, and other countries. Moody highlights the common ideological features which are found in radical right populist movements around the world. One of those ideas is the appropriateness and inevitability of inequalities and hierarchy, the superiority of some groups, which in the US takes the form of white supremacy, a tendency towards racism and anti-Semitism and anti-Islam intolerance and bigotry, a tendency towards nativism, nationalism, and xenophobia. These are all ideological currents and rhetorical lines of speech and mobilization which have been constant and recurring themes within radical right populism. And regrettably, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and in the US, outright racism against African Americans and people of color, these are recurring themes in right-wing populism. This quote is an important one, and because there are a lot of quotes in today's slides, I won't read all the quotes, but I trust that you will also open up the slide PDF as well. In addition to the themes of racism and anti-Semitism and intolerance, a second important theme which Moody finds is a recurring willingness to encourage, to valorize, and to use violence as a political tool. And attacks on persons of targeted groups have occurred with increasing frequency, again, all around the world, but in the United States also. Christchurch in New Zealand, the attack on a synagogue in Pittsburgh, the attack by a right-wing nationalist, fascist in Norway, and in Michigan only a week ago, the conspiracy to kidnap and harm the governor of the state. These are alarming signs of a willingness of right-wing organizations to use violence in pursuit of their racist and extremist views. The government has now paid more attention to lone wolf attacks, but it seems fairly clear around the world that there are also coordinated networks of adherents, which regrettably find expression on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and other social media accounts. Paramilitary organizations, in particular, militia groups, which we have an abundance of here in the state of Michigan. But they're found around the world. They're found in Hungary, in Italy, in the Czech Republic, in Greece, and in other parts of the United States. And these groups make use of intimidation, make use of numbers of members wearing uniforms, wearing weapons, often in other countries bringing dogs with them. In many countries, these displays of force are used to intimidate their opponents and to intimidate the groups of people, whether it's the Roma, gypsy people in many countries in Europe, or homosexual and gay people in the United States, or black and brown people in the United States. The use of paramilitary displays of force is now becoming a more common part of right-wing tactics. It is very clear that the populist radical right is growing rapidly in many or even most Western democracies. And Mudde is really very interested in trying to understand the dynamics of that growth and also what can be done to avert an even more serious degradation of democracies, institutions, and values in the Western democracies. And his primary recommendation is, in one way, maybe a slightly surprising one. He does not believe that more laws, like the laws in some Western European countries, Germany and France, laws banning the ultra-right, the far right, he doesn't believe that that is a viable solution. Instead, he believes that the most viable long-term solution is to strengthen liberal democracy. Here I will quote, "The ultimate goal of all responses to the far right should be the strengthening of liberal democracy. Put simply, only fighting the far right, through legislation, for example, does not necessarily strengthen liberal democracy, but strengthening liberal democracy will, by definition, weaken the far right." And so here the idea is that we as citizens should be together in supporting and advocating for our democratic institutions, the values of our democracy. We should join together in groups which are vocal and fervent in our support of liberal democracy. Now, that being said, liberal democracy is not without an ability to defend itself against violence. And we've seen that, again, most recently in the state of Michigan. But so we can also add to Mudde's remarks that it is entirely appropriate for liberal democracies to have legislation, appropriate legal and constitutional legislation using police powers to prevent violence and violent conspiracies. Now let's turn to McAdam and Kloos and their very, very interesting book about American politics called Deeply Divided. McAdam is a sociologist, political sociologist, whose work I really admire. He wrote an early book, in fact it was his dissertation, I believe, called Political Process and the Development of Black Insurgency, a study of the American U.S. Civil Rights Movement. And in 2001, he joined with Chuck Tilley and Sid Tarrow in authoring a book called The Dynamics of Contention, which is an important study of the mechanisms through which political and social conflict transpires. So McAdam is an acknowledged and important expert on social movements and politics. In the current book, the book that you're reading just a little bit of, I would be delighted to have you read the whole book, Kloos and McAdam argue that two important processes are crucial for understanding in recent U.S. politics. First, there has been a dramatic rise in the level of inequality, economic inequality, wealth and income inequality that's found in the United States since about 1960 or 1970. And then secondly, there is a great rise in the use of racist intolerance in the population that the right, the GOP, the Republican Party, employs to gain electoral support. And they believe that these processes are linked to a third important process, which is the process of political polarization. And so what they're really wanting to offer is a theory or a set of analyses which account for the processes through which American politics have devolved in a direction of creating more and more political division and a politics which is divided around topics of race. So let's take a look at this graph. This is an intriguing graph. The solid line in this graph is it's called the Lorenz curve, but it's a measure of, it's a little more complicated than that, but it is a measure of inequality. And as you see, U.S. inequality started high in the 1920s, then declined dramatically throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s, was at a low point in the 1950s, and then began to rise again fairly dramatically. So the solid line is inequalities. The two dashed lines are measures of polarization in the two national legislative houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And what is striking about the graph is how closely they conform. Inequalities fall and then rise, and polarization of politics, as expressed in the Congress, fall and rise according to basically the same time frame. And so you might be led to think rising inequalities, that's the cause of rising polarization. But actually, McAdam and Kloos think the opposite is true. They believe that the increase in polarization has in fact led to rising inequalities rather than the reverse. Essentially, they believe that Republican control of the White House, control of Congress at various periods during this period of time has led to an ability to create tax legislation and other favorable treatment of the wealthy in this country, which has led to rising inequality. So on the one hand, political elections have consequences, as our current Republican majority likes to say. And one of those consequences is an ability to determine tax policy and other economic policies in ways which favor more wealthy people. So inequalities have increased. But then the second part of their point is that in order to maintain their electoral supremacy, Republicans have sought, since the time of Reagan, 1980, have sought to find issues which allow them to maintain an electoral majority, and the issues that they've sought out are often implicated with the politics of racial division. So essentially we can put their theory down to a statement something like this: the struggle for economic advantage for the wealthy has pushed the politics of polarization and the tactic of racial antagonism and voter suppression, which we'll be talking about shortly. Now let's talk about the appeal or the analysis which they offer of social movements in political parties, because they believe that political polarization at the level of the Congress has been driven in part by the activism that has been expressed in social movements like the Tea Party, but other social movements as well. And they identify two particularly important social movements which have occurred since the 1960s. So they single out the civil rights movement as a progressive movement for racial justice, which occurred in the 1960s, and then what they refer to as the white backlash movement, which was both a social movement but also a political strategy on the part of the GOP following the civil rights movement. And they argue that these two movements created kind of a dialectic or kind of a dynamic of political progression, which led to a logic of increased polarization and brought forward an increasingly sharp antagonism based on the politics of racial division. GOP politicians, including Richard Nixon and Newt Gingrich in different decades, the 1970s and the 1990s, seized upon white resentment as a political tool for electoral success with voters in the South. This is the key idea which is expressed in Deeply Divided. So it's worth noticing that the polarization which we see in the United States At least as of 2012, when this book was primarily researched. It would be very interesting to kind of redo the empirical public opinion research now. But as of 2012, 2013, what McAdam and Kloos find is that polarization is characteristic of the professional political class, but not characteristic of the mass population or the public. And so they use public opinion polling on a number of important, apparently divisive issues, like abortion policy, gun control, civil rights legislation, affirmative action. And what they show is that there has been remarkable constancy in the public on reasonable solutions to these public policy issues. But politicians and elected officials have become more and more polarized around these issues. And they call out the Tea Party in particular for its underlying appeal to the racial attitudes of followers. They argue that the Tea Party presented itself as a social movement, a grassroots movement, which was aimed at controlling federal expenditures. But in fact, they argue the Tea Party was motivated by racial attitudes more than fiscal attitudes. And they also describe this movement, along with some other social movements that they identify, as being an astroturf movement, one which pretends to be a grassroots movement, depending on ordinary people, but is actually artificial and is supported behind the scenes by organized national funding. So there have been, according to McAdam and Kloos, a couple of important pivot points in US history since, let's say, 1960. The revitalization of the civil rights struggle in the late 1950s, 1960s, upset a political kind of unspoken compromise between Democrats and Republicans to not interfere with racial inequalities in the South. And the civil rights struggle in the 1960s, and then landmark legislation, civil rights legislation, voter rights legislation and so forth, enacted by Lyndon Johnson following the assassination of John F. Kennedy, that this realignment of the politics of the Democrat Party and the Republican Party led to substantial disruption of a political compromise. And the GOP then sought out a new strategy. Here's a quote that I think is worth reading. Much to the consternation of the GOP's once dominant liberal moderate establishment, people like Nelson Rockefeller, Nixon's narrow victory clearly suggested that the party's future lay not in the 43% of the popular vote that he received, but in the 57% he shared with George Wallace. That's a really striking quote, because Wallace ran as a third-party candidate and he gained another 14% or so of the vote. And so what they're saying is that Republican strategists came to the conclusion that it was for the future of their electoral success, they needed to capture those voters who were disgruntled, people unhappy with the realignment of racial politics in the direction of greater racial justice. So that was one important change. A second important change came in the 1970s, 1970 to 72 in particular, where the 1968 Democrat convention was a fiasco. There was an effort by Democrats to control the convention process, which failed, and there were reforms both in the Democrat Party and the Republican Party to make primaries more important in the process of identifying candidates. And so greater democracy in the primary process led to what is maybe an unexpected result, and that is greater grassroots control of the nomination process, which gave social movements and small groups of activists much greater influence than they had in the past. In the context of the primary reforms of the 1970s, a small base could demand compliance from candidates by threatening defeat in the primaries. And if you have paid attention to the politics of Michigan, in particular in the Republican Party, moderate Republicans were a primary part of Michigan's political leadership in the 1950s and 60s. But moderate Republicans have been soundly defeated through the primary process by more conservative Tea Party type Republicans. McAdam and Kloos see Ronald Reagan as being a turning point in this politics of division. They find that Ronald Reagan racialized his political rhetoric in a way which fundamentally changed the nature of U.S. electoral competition. And from the point of view of the themes of this course, he brought race into electoral competition in a way which was very hard to remove. Newt Gingrich was a politician I remember very well from the 1990s, and he simply lived for a divisive, division-based approach to politics. He was a political entrepreneur who thrived on cultivating of divisions between different groups of people. So again, here's a quote that I thought was probably worth reading. The strategy was to depict the GOP as the party of the law-abiding, tax-paying, silent, mostly white majority, and to demonize the Democrats as the party of liberals and the undeserving, disproportionately minority poor, whose dependence on social programs was taking money out of the pockets of hardworking, overtaxed white Americans. And this theme becomes an important Tea Party theme as well. There's a very interesting social science theory, a public opinion research theory, which McAdam and Kloos refer to, in order to give substance to their analysis of the underlying racial identity of the Tea Party. And this is the idea of social dominance orientation, SDO. And what they find is that there is this theory within social psychology, which was developed by Jim Sidanius, a prominent social psychologist. And it is a measure of individual political motivation, political psychology, defined as, quote, a preference for inequality among social groups. A preference for inequality among social groups. It is the opposite of egalitarianism. And the opposite also of the idea that all men or all human beings are created equal, and instead the idea that some groups are superior to, more deserving than other groups. Not necessarily racial, but with clear racial implications. So this is a measure, and survey technology, survey instruments have been designed to evaluate social dominance orientation scores. And it turns out, they report the data, that followers of the Tea Party tend to have a higher SDO score than other citizens. So let's go back to Ronald Reagan and recall 1976. One of his primary challenges against his political opponents was to refer repeatedly to an unnamed welfare queen from Chicago who had amassed a small fortune by using multiple Social Security cards to fraudulently collect welfare and other government benefits. A welfare queen. Here's what he actually said. There's a woman in Chicago. She has 80 names, 30 addresses, 12 Social Security cards. She's got Medicaid. She's getting food stamps, and she is collecting welfare under each of their names. Her tax-free cash income is over $150,000. It was a great story, McAdam and Kloos say, one perfectly calibrated to curry the support of outraged white voters. Too bad it wasn't really true. So that's Reagan using the racism associated with the welfare queen story. But recall, Mitt Romney used very similar statements in his campaign against President Obama in 2012. So this kind of coded use of racist language has been a staple of political mobilization since the 1970s. So it's an important question for us. Why did old-fashioned racism become so overt and explicit during the Obama administration? And again, here's a passage I wanted to quote. The question is, this is quoting from McAdam and Kloos, the question is, where did this upsurge in old-fashioned racism come from? Based on the best survey data on support for the Tea Party, it seems reasonable to credit the Tea Party movement, for at least some of the infusion of more extreme racial views and actions into American politics. We begin by considering the racial attitudes of Tea Party supporters and what that suggests about the animating racial politics of the movement wing of the Republican Party. In this, we rely on two sources of data: multi-state surveys of support for the Tea Party and Abramowitz's analysis of the October 2010 wave of the American National Election Studies. So this is political science at its best. It's making use of opinion surveys and public opinion surveys to try to tease out what were the underlying attitudes and values which were in play during these crucial elections, 2008, 2010, 2012. The authors also make the point that the GOP has not only embraced the politics of race in terms of ideology and cultivating support on the basis of racial antagonism, but have also made very specific efforts in the states that they control to suppress the vote of people of color, African American people, urban people, and to use their power of redistricting, where they govern the state house, to create gerrymandered districts which minimize the electoral impact of people of color and black and brown people. To quote from them, "Nor is the imprint of race and racism on today's GOP only a matter of attitudes. It also is reflected in the party's transparent efforts to disenfranchise poor and minority voters in the run-up to the 2012 election. It may well be that the country has never seen a more coordinated national effort to constrain the voting rights of particular groups than we saw in 2012. Throughout the country, Republican legislators and other officials sought to enact new laws or modify established voting procedures, which, in virtually all instances, would have made it harder, in some instances much harder, for poor and minority voters to exercise the franchise." Notice that this was written concerning the 2012 election, and if you pay any attention to what's happening today in terms of efforts to minimize and suppress the vote of poor and minority voters, the situation is even worse today. Gerrymandering has turned into a data-rich art. If you look at the graphs of a couple of congressional districts in various states, including Michigan, the use by legislators, most commonly Republican legislators, though there also is a history of Democratic gerrymandering, but the use of very detailed information about voter behavior has allowed legislatures to shape districts so as to minimize the likelihood of a substantial reversal of elections in favor of Democrats. There's very strong evidence showing that these efforts of GOP-dominated legislatures have been aimed at reducing the impact of traditional voting blocs of Democrats, including especially districts representing people of color. And here again, it would be very interesting to do a follow-on study now 8 years later and to see how much more extensive these efforts are today. So the unanswered question for us in this course is this: why does racism work as a political platform? Why does the appeal to racism, to anti-Semitism, xenophobia, anti-Muslim bigotry work in so many countries and in so many settings? I think we have to ask whether there is an underlying political emotion of fear and potential suspicion and animosity towards the other that is a latent basis of motivation. and a basis of motivation that xenophobic leaders, parties, and movements can always call upon. I think we have to ask ourselves, are the politics of us and them unavoidable? And is it possible, again, the key question for this course, is it possible to build a durable sense of multicultural, multi-religious, and multiracial democracy, liberal democracy, that engenders support from the great majority of citizens?